Antarctica, the food chain starts beneath the ice pack. Extremophile algae act as a food source for krill. This is the most abundant group of creatures on Earth. In summer, this kind of shrimp gathers in vast groups, which can cover a surface of 500 square kilometers and weigh 2 million tons. Krill is an essential energy source for most of the species living in the frozen waters of Antarctica.
We're going down to 125 meters, 125.
The ICOTA scientific mission is studying this food chain in the cold waters of the Antarctic.
It's fine, we're going to 200 meters.
It is directed by Philip Kuby, professor of the Villefranche-sur-Mer Oceanographic Laboratory. If there are so many krill, it's because of the extraordinary proliferation of cold water vegetal plankton.
Well, there, it's really dense in phytoplankton. It's a real soup. To have a rich supply of plankton, several conditions have to be met. Firstly, things have to favor the development of phytoplankton, i.e. vegetal plankton. As for plants, there has to be light, and there's a lot of light in this summer period around the poles. Next, nutritive salts are needed, and these salts tend to be more concentrated towards the depths. To bring them up to the surface, it requires either storms or upward movement of cold water, and these conditions are met frequently on the Antarctic continental shelf.
Plankton is made up of hundreds of plant and animal species. It is already in itself a true food chain, perfectly adapted to the cold. At the base of the chain are the diatoms, micro-algae which appeared on Earth 150 million years ago. In vast numbers, they create more than half of the oxygen which we breathe. Diatom are consumed by foraminifera. These organisms use their filaments to catch their food and to move. Diatom and foraminifera are very simple, made up by a single cell and by a shell. These microscopic shells made of silicon or calcium are true architectural masterpieces. To ensure the best rigidity for their shell, these organisms invented, well before we did, corrugated roofs, cellular fiberboard, and honeycomb structures. Diatom and foraminifera are food in turn for animal plankton. This is essentially made up of crustaceans, jellyfish, and krill. This zooplankton feeds in its turn a strange extremophile fauna which lives below the ice pack. But how do these organisms survive in water that is at -2 degrees?
Adaptation to the cold in a polar environment is made in two fashions. The first possibility is to increase the internal salt quantity. So adding salt to the body means that where the freezing point is becomes a lot better for these creatures. The other possibility is to add tiny organic molecules like sugar or glucose, for example, or other tiny molecules which equally mean that the creature needn't fear freezing at 0 degrees.
It's the icefish that push adaptive measures the furthest. Philip Kuby goes to the French research station Dermont-d'Urville to use the ROV, a radio-controlled submarine robot capable of diving to more than 100 meters depth, which is where the champion of survival in cold water lives.
There, the ROV is at 174 metres, and in relation to classical fishing, what's good with the ROV is that one can observe the individuals in their environment, explain how its habitat works, and also study its behaviour, something which is very, very difficult, in fact impossible to do by fishing. And here we see the typical behaviour of these fish. They're fish which tend to wait on the bottom. And there, see, it's a little disturbed, so it moves. And they're on the lookout.
To expend as little energy as possible in the cold waters, the fish sits in currents rich in plankton and only has to wait with its mouth wide open. Thus, the icefish constantly filters the oxygen found in the water because it's the only invertebrate on Earth that doesn't have any hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the pigment which tints our blood red. It carries oxygen through the body. The blood of the icefish has none, which is why their blood is white or transparent. It takes the oxygen it needs directly from the water.
We're in a very cold environment where there is a lot of oxygen, and these fish have gills with a very large surface, so the exchange is better. Their heart is a lot bigger, which improves blood circulation, and oxygen arrives directly in their tissues. This modification probably is only found in cold environments, and probably couldn't happen in other environments.
But at these polar temperatures, the main problem of the icefish and most other fish is avoiding being frozen on the spot. They live in such a cold environment that the water entering their mouths can freeze a part of their digestive system. Luckily for them, they produce a protein which acts on frozen tissue and stops the ice from spreading. But it's Philippe Kubi and his team that risk freezing if they don't return quickly to base because a glacial wind is rising. Katabatic winds are the most violent Antarctic winds, with peaks at 300 kilometers per hour. They slide on the glaciers and accelerate with the cold. On the islands of the far south, a fly has learnt how to resist these winds and this cold. The fly also has anti-freezing sugars to survive these hostile conditions, but the most remarkable adaptation is the loss of its wings. In such an extreme environment, predators are rare, and the need to fly to escape them is no longer a priority. Moreover, this loss offers two big advantages: less surface for the wind to catch and fat reserves which have taken the place of flight muscles. Stocking an energy reserve is the key to survival in the Antarctic for many species, and in particular for the Adelie penguin. This emblematic Antarctic bird is also a model of adaptation. The Adelie penguin and the emperor penguin are in fact the only species to have colonized the lowest latitudes of Earth. On the Dumont d'Urville base, a research program on its capacities to manage energy is completely dedicated to the penguins. It's directed by Mireille Racoeur, CNRS biologist.
The Biomar laboratory was constructed because of the proximity of this colony, which is quite spread out. This allows us to follow a colony, always the same one, because in 80% of cases, the male, which returns the first, is faithful to its nest. So it will return to the same nest and, in theory, find the same female there.
The reproductive period is the ideal moment to study the energy-managing capacities of the penguins. They stock large quantities of fat in order to be able to feed their offspring. So mind you put the cover in place for the chicks. The male has to stay close to the nest all the time to bring warmth and protect the chicks. When a penguin is trapped for analysis, it is therefore vital to isolate the chicks from the attacks of the skuas.
These creatures, alternating between periods of fast and periods of heavy feeding, are capable of becoming almost obese. When they get to the month of October, they're all round. Then they can embark on a period where they fast for 30 days, of at least 20 days for the male if he's hatching the eggs. So they're always on the razor's edge from a point of view of their nutritive budget. And that's what's important. That means that they know how to manage their energy reserve, their period of fast, their period of overfeeding, in an extremely fine way in order to survive.
Mireille Ricoeur has to take tissue samples to completely understand these energy management mechanisms.
We're taking away a few feathers at the site of the incision so that it's as clean as possible because the feathers are really full of infections.
But the feathers are also the best weapon of the penguin to fight against the cold. The penguin has a very dense plumage, 17 feathers per square centimetre. Furthermore, these feathers cover a thick down. Its thermal insulation is almost perfect and allows it to spend long hours in frozen water looking for its food. What is it that allows the penguin to spend so much energy in such a glacial environment? To understand this phenomenon, Mireille Ricoeur takes samples of the fatty tissues of the penguin.
We'll conserve about 200 milligrams of tissue in this liquid nitrogen. Liquid nitrogen is one of the best preserving agents for studying the expression of different genes which are implicated in adipogenesis or in explaining their storage capacity.
The penguin comes out of this experience unharmed. It immediately returns to its chicks that await their food with impatience. Young penguins have extremely rapid growth, which requires as much energy as they use to combat the cold.
At 15 days, about when they're 15 days old, they're not under the incubation pouch anymore. So it's at that moment that they absolutely must put all their thermogenic processes in place, all the metabolic processes which will allow them to stand up to the cold.
These mechanisms, which Mireille Ricoeur calls thermogenic, concern all the processes which allow the penguins to raise their body heat to fight against the cold. When the temperature drops below -20 degrees, the penguin's response is astonishing. It doesn't shiver and it doesn't run to get warm. On the contrary, it becomes immobile. This is because its internal organism is then completely taken up with these processes of fighting against the cold.
These thermogenic processes are situated on the cellular level, or really subcellular, in the little units which are called mitochondria. Mitochondria are often compared to reactors because they provide the energy which is indispensable for the different vital functions of the organism. These mitochondria are capable of uncoupling like a motor which doesn't work well. When it's out of order, the vehicle goes slower and the motor heats up because it's not regulated. Well, mitochondria are a bit similar. So they use energy reserves to produce energy, and when it's unregulated, it produces a little less energy for vital functions and starts producing heat.
The penguin is therefore perfectly adapted to confront the great cold of the Antarctic. But in the context of global warming, these glacial periods are less and less common. When it becomes warm, all these adaptations become handicaps. To ventilate, the penguin lifts its wings and opens its beak wide.
They're practically in a homeothermic state. That is to say, they no longer produce heat because it's very warm. They're in the sun, and they're even suffering from the heat because, as you see, they've got their beaks open, they're in polypnea, and so are their chicks. So we can imagine that these creatures, that are very well adapted to the cold, will really suffer from climatic warming.
The penguins can always dive into the frozen water to freshen up while feeding, but climatic warming also menaces most of the species they feed upon.
So whatever kind of fish or organism we're observing, many of these organisms are what is called stenothermal, a term which means that the capacity of the species to adapt in relation to the maximum and minimum temperature can never be more than that of a difference of 4 to 6 degrees. It is well known from physiological studies and studies in biochemistry that a slight increase of temperature can have catastrophic effects on certain species, notably these species here.
The scientific community is in agreement on global planetary warming, and this warming is even more marked at the poles. We know that 1 degree of warming all over the planet means 2 degrees increase at the poles. And that means, concretely, massive and major changes in living conditions for these organisms. That will then mean that these extremophiles, which are particularly adapted to their native conditions, so to say, will be particularly and directly endangered. And these are probably the first organisms on Earth which will heavily suffer from current climate changes.
It took millions of years for these microorganisms to adapt and conquer these freezing environments. It will take perhaps less than 50 years for the greater part of them to become extinct, and with them, entire ecosystems will vanish.